Some stories are just stories, yarns you spin over a drink. This one, however, is the absolute truth of how I spent my 73rd year. It's the reason I no longer have a nephew. The first time I knew my nephew Daniel wanted me dead was when his lawyer slid the voluntary assisted dying form across the antique mahogany desk, my signature line already highlighted in a sickly fluorescent yellow. We were in a stuffy, wood-paneled office on Broad Street in Charleston. The afternoon sun, cutting through the dusty blinds, illuminating the smug, pitying smile on Daniel's face. He'd brought me here under the guise of updating my will, a thoughtful gesture he'd said to make things easier down the road. But there it was, a document that would allow a doctor to end my life, presented as casually as if it were a consent form for a flu shot. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My late wife, Eleanor, had always said, Daniel had his father's eyes, but his mother's soul, and she hadn't meant it as a compliment. My sister, God rest her soul, was a woman who saw people as instruments for her own convenience. After she and her husband passed in that car wreck on I-26, Daniel was all I had left. He was 29, handsome in a forgettable way, with a finance job in Charlotte that he spoke of in grand vague terms. For the past year, he'd become exceptionally attentive, calling weekly, driving down to my historic home, south of Broad once a month with groceries and feigned concern. Just checking on my favorite uncle, he'd say, his eyes sweeping over the Georgian furniture and the maritime paintings. Eleanor and I had collected over 50 years. He wasn't checking on me. He was taking inventory. I looked from the form to Daniel, then to the lawyer, a man named Croft with predatory eyes and a suit that cost more than my first car. I let the silence hang in the air, a thick, uncomfortable blanket. My hands, spotted with age, but steady, rested on the arms of the leather chair I had spent 30 years as a logistics analyst for the Department of Defense. My entire life had been about seeing the variables, understanding the supply chain of human intent. I didn't just see the form. I saw the entire operation behind it. The months of fake sincerity, the careful selection of a morally flexible lawyer, the calculated gamble that I was just a dottery old man, ready to be put out to pasture Daniel. I said, my voice even betraying none of the cold fury coiling in my gut. I have a touch of arthritis in my right knee, and my blood pressure is a little high on Tuesdays. Otherwise, my doctor says, I'm fit as a fiddle. Why would I be signing something like this? Daniel leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. He performed a perfect pantomime of compassion. Uncle Art, let's be honest. You're 73. You live alone in that big house. It's a lot to manage. This is just about having options. It's about dignity. Planning for the future, so you don't have to suffer. The only thing I was suffering from at that moment was a sudden, intense clarity. He wasn't just a greedy fool. He was arrogant. He thought my age had softened my mind, that the quiet life of a widower had dulled my senses. He saw a liability, a stubborn old man sitting on a multi-million-dollar historic Charleston property and a stock portfolio that could fuel his reckless lifestyle for decades. Croft, the lawyer, cleared his throat. Arthur, the document is purely a contingency. It simply gives you the power to make a choice should your health decline rapidly. Daniel is merely trying to be a responsible nephew, ensuring your wishes are legally protected. My legally protected wish, I said, tapping a single finger on the highlighted line, is to see my 74th birthday and my 75th, and with any luck to outlive men who wear $3,000 suits to discuss the premature death of their clients. Croft's jaw tightened. Daniel's mask of concern flickered, revealing a flash of raw, petulant anger. He'd miscalculated. He had expected me to be confused, maybe even grateful. He had not expected resistance. He had certainly not expected contempt. I stood up slowly, my knee giving a slight twinge, just to remind me I wasn't 30 anymore. I picked up the VAD form, folded it neatly in half, and then in half again. I walked over to the ornate, non-functioning fireplace that dominated the wall. I placed the folded paper on the marble mantelpiece, a small white square of pure malice. "Thank you both for a most illuminating afternoon," I said, turning to face them. "Daniel, don't bother driving down next month. I'll be changing the locks. As for my will, Mr. Croft, you'll be hearing from my new attorney." Daniel shot out of his chair. "Uncle Art, you're being irrational. You're not thinking clearly." "Oh, I assure you," I said, locking eyes with him, letting him see for the first time the man who used to brief generals on enemy movements. "My thinking has never been clearer." I walked out of that office, leaving the door open behind me, and stepped into the humid Charleston air. The clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage filled with tourists echoed down the street. They were seeing the charming historic South. I was seeing a battlefield. Daniel wouldn't give up. The euthanasia form was Plan A, the civilized option. He had failed to persuade me to sign my own death warrant. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that he was already moving on to Plan B. And Plan B wouldn't involve any paperwork. My nephew had just declared war, and he had no idea who he was fighting. He thought he was hunting a sheep. He was about to find out he'd cornered a wolf. The first thing I did wasn't to hire a new lawyer or call the police. The police would see a family dispute, a misunderstanding at best, an old man's paranoia. No, the first step in any engagement is reconnaissance. You don't fight what you can't see. That night, I sat in my study, the house silent around me, the scent of old books and lemon oil polish, a comforting familiarity. But the comfort was gone. The familiar spaces, the foyer where Eleanor would greet me, the garden she'd spent decades cultivating, now felt like unsecured perimeters. Every creak of the floorboards was a potential intruder. Every shadow was a threat. My past life, the one I'd packed away like an old uniform, was not something I ever spoke of. To my neighbors, I was Arthur Penn, the quiet widower who grew prize-winning camellias. No one knew that for 3 decades, I was Arthur Penn, the analyst, who could map out a terrorist cell's network from a handful of garbled radio intercepts. The skills I discovered were rusting, but not gone. I booted up my old desktop computer, a machine I mostly used for emailing photos of my garden to old friends. It was time to dig into the life of Daniel Fletcher. He was careless, as most arrogant people are. His social media was a curated portfolio of his projected success. Grinning on a ski boat on Lake Norman, holding a bottle of champagne at a rooftop bar in Charlotte, standing beside a leased BMW. But his real life was in the digital breadcrumbs he left elsewhere. I started with a simple deep dive background check, using a service I still had a quiet, unofficial access to through a former colleague. Daniel's grand finance job was at a third-rate brokerage firm, known for high-risk, high-churn clients. He'd been sued twice by former investors for mismanagement. Both suits were settled out of court. He had 2 maxed-out lines of credit and a lien against his condo for unpaid homeowners association dues. The boy wasn't just living beyond his means. He was drowning in debt. That was the motive, clear as day. The why now, I needed the how. How was he planning to get from uncooperative uncle to grieving heir? I set up alerts on his name, his email addresses, his known associates. I used a simple remote access program. Digital Ghost. I could slip into his laptop through a phishing email disguised as a security alert from his bank. It was a classic simple exploit, and his sloppy digital hygiene made him an easy target. Within a day, I was in. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was mapping the terrain of his intentions. I found search histories that made my blood run cold, painless poisons that mimic heart attack, inheritance law, South Carolina, no will. How to hire a private investigator to find assets. He was clumsy and amateur, but an amateur with intent is still a predator. Then I found the emails. They weren't to a professional hitman. They were to a man named Shane Riley, a bouncer at a dive bar in North Charleston with a string of minor assault charges. The exchange was pathetically transparent. Daniel, using a thinly veiled code, spoke of a problem with a squatter in a valuable property. Shane's replies were blunt, barely literate, and greedy. They talked about a removal fee, $50,000. 10 up front, the rest on completion. Daniel had wired the first $10,000 from a new bank account 2 weeks ago. My meeting with the lawyer hadn't been plan A. It was just a final, desperate attempt to get me to do the job for them to save himself $40,000. I found a second name in the emails, Ricky, Shane's partner. A quick search revealed Ricky Combs, a small-time drug dealer with a record for breaking and entering. These weren't assassins. They were thugs, hired muscle, that made them both less predictable and more dangerous. Professionals are clean. They have rules. These two would be messy, prone to panic, and likely to use brute force. I now had their names. I had the proof of payment. I had their entire plan laid out on my screen. I could have gone to the police. Then I had enough for a conspiracy charge at the very least. But I knew Daniel. He would cry misunderstanding. His lawyer, Croft, would muddy the waters, paint me as a senile old man, misinterpreting things, and claim Daniel was trying to hire security for me. They would get a slap on the wrist, and the threat would remain simmering under the surface, waiting for another chance. No, a defensive strategy was no longer sufficient. You don't show a rabid dog its reflection. You put it down. My objective was no longer survival. It was victory, a complete and total dismantling of my nephew's life. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the gaslit street below. The ancient live oaks, draped in Spanish moss, stood like silent sentinels. This house had stood for 200 years. It had survived wars, hurricanes, and earthquakes. It'd be damned if I was going to let it, and the life Eleanor and I had built within its walls, fall into the hands of a spoiled, murderous child and a pair of cheap thugs. The fear I had felt leaving Croft's office was gone, burned away by a cold, quiet resolve. Daniel had bought himself a war. I was about to deliver it to his doorstep. My home was no longer just a residence. It was about to become a theater of operations, and I knew the stage better than anyone. The first move had to be mine. A preemptive strike, not of aggression but of information. Daniel and his two goons were operating under the assumption that their target was a frail, technologically illiterate senior. It was time to correct that assumption in a way that would spook them, make them question their intelligence, and sow the first seeds of discord. I needed to let them know I was watching without ever showing my face. My years in analysis taught me that psychological leverage is often more powerful than physical force. An enemy who is afraid is an enemy who makes mistakes. I started with Shane Riley, the bouncer. He was the point of contact, the so-called leader. From his social media, a cesspool of bar fights and blurry photos of cheap beer, I learned he lived in a rundown apartment complex in Hanahan, just outside of Charleston. I also learned he drove a beat-up 1998 Ford Ranger and was pathologically proud of it. That truck was my point of entry. One evening, dressed in the bland, forgettable attire of a retiree out for a walk, cocky. Pants, a polo shirt, a floppy hat. I took a drive. I parked 3 blocks away from his apartment building and approached on foot. It was a humid, oppressive evening, the air thick with the smell of marsh mud and desperation. His truck was exactly where I expected it to be, parked under a buzzing sodium light, its paint peeling and one taillight cracked. The job took less than 5 minutes. I wasn't breaking in. I was delivering a message. I had a small magnetic GPS tracker, no bigger than a book of matches. I'd bought a dozen of them online, listed as asset tracking for commercial fleets. I knelt down, feigning a need to tie my shoe, and slapped it onto the inside of his rear steel bumper. It was dirty work, but necessary. Step 1 complete. Now I could see every move he made. Then came the psychological piece. I had a small Bluetooth-enabled speaker, also magnetic. I reached under the driver's side door and attached it deep within the chassis, well out of sight. It was a ghost in his machine. I went home and waited. I watched on my laptop as the tracker showed Shane's truck moving from his apartment to the dive bar where he worked. He stayed there for his entire shift. Then around 2:15 a.m., the truck started moving again. He was heading home. I waited until his GPS signal showed him turning onto the main highway, a long, dark stretch of road. I opened the speakers app on my phone. I had preloaded a single audio file. It was a simple sound, but deeply unsettling, a high-resolution recording of a man clearing his throat, followed by a low, drawn-out whisper of a single word. Shane. I hit play. Then I disconnected. I imagined him alone in his truck, the dark road flying by, when a disembodied voice whispers his name from somewhere inside the vehicle itself. He'd stop. He'd search. He would find nothing. He would think he was losing his mind. He'd tell his partner Ricky, who would laugh at him, call him paranoid. The first wedge was driven. For the next few days, I did nothing but watch. I tracked their movements. They met twice, once in a Waffle House parking lot, and once at a secluded boat ramp on the Ashley River. They were planning. Their pattern of movement showed them driving by my house multiple times, always slowing down, casing the property. They were building their operational picture. So was I. My house was my greatest advantage. It was a classic Charleston single house, long and narrow, 1 room wide with piazzas running down the side. It was a labyrinth of history, full of quirks and secrets that only I knew. During a renovation 10 years ago, it had the entire place rewired. At the time, it paid extra for the electricians to run Cat6, Ethernet cable and coaxial cable, to every single room, even the closets. Eleanor had called it my technological obsession. I'd told her it was for future-proofing. Now that future had arrived, I purchased a set of high-definition night vision-capable micro-cameras. They were tiny, easily concealable, and powered over the Ethernet cables I already had in the walls. For 3 days I became an installer. One camera was hidden in the antique gas lantern by my front gate, giving me a perfect view of the street. Another was tucked into the dense leaves of a magnolia tree covering the side piazza. I put one in the garden, concealed inside a hollowed-out birdhouse. I had the entire perimeter of my property under 247 surveillance, all feeding into a secure server. I set up in my basement. Daniel, meanwhile, was getting impatient. I could feel it through the terse, demanding emails he sent to Shane, which I was, of course, monitoring. The whispered name in the truck had worked better than I'd hoped. Shane was jumpy, demanding more money for the increased risk. Daniel, hemorrhaging cash, was refusing. Their partnership was fraying before they'd even made a move. This was when Daniel made his next mistake. He decided to take matters into his own hands, to apply pressure himself. He called me one afternoon. His tone was syrupy. Sweet Uncle Art. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. I was just worried about you. How about I come down this weekend? We can go to lunch at Hall's Chop House. Your favorite Hall's Chop House on King Street, the site of a dozen family celebrations. The place I took him for his 21st birthday. The place Eleanor and I had our last anniversary dinner. He was using my memories as a weapon. I don't think so. Daniel, I said coolly. Come on, Uncle. Don't be like this. I'm worried you're isolating yourself. People are starting to talk. Mrs. Gable from next door said she saw you talking to your roses the other day. The lie was so blatant, so insulting. Marian Gable had been my neighbor for 40 years. She knew I talked to my roses. It was a running joke between us. Daniel was trying to build a narrative of my senility, planting seeds of doubt with my friends and neighbors. This was his idea of a sophisticated attack. It was pathetic, but it was also dangerous. A narrative can be as deadly as a weapon. That call solidified my resolve. The game of whispers and shadows was over. It was time to escalate. I needed to get his hired guns on my property. I needed to get them on camera, to get their intent recorded in high-definition video and audio. And to do that, I had to give them a reason to come. I had to present them with an opportunity they couldn't resist. A few days later, I made a very public, very deliberate show of leaving my house. I told Mrs. Gable I was driving up to Columbia for 2 nights to visit an old army buddy. I packed an overnight bag, loaded it into my Volvo, and drove away, making sure to wave cheerfully as I went. I drove for an hour heading north on I-26, then pulled off at a small town, had dinner, and waited for nightfall. Then I turned around and drove back, not to my house, but to a small prepaid hotel room in Mount Pleasant, across the Cooper River. In the hotel room, I opened my laptop. The live feeds from my cameras filled the screen. My house sat quiet and dark under the moonlight. The trap was set. The bait was out. I had a clear view of the street, the gate, the garden, and the piazzas. Now all I had to do was wait. I didn't have to wait long. Just before 100 a.m., a familiar beat-up Ford Ranger rolled slowly down my street and parked in the shadows, 2 houses down. My heart, for the first time, began to pound in my chest. 2 dark figures emerged from the truck. The invasion was beginning. From the grainy night vision feed on my laptop, I watched them, Shane and Ricky. Even in silhouette, their body language screamed amateur Shane. The bouncer was bulky and moved with a heavy-footed confidence. Ricky, the burglar, was wiry and skittish, his head on a constant swivel. They were dressed in dark hoodies and jeans, the universal uniform of petty criminals who think they're invisible. They crept along the wrought iron fence of my neighbor's property before stopping at my front gate. The camera and the gas lantern captured the scene perfectly. You sure the old man's gone? Ricky's voice was a tinny whisper through the microphone. It hidden in the same lantern. Daniel said he's gone for 2 nights. Said he watched him pack a bag and drive off. Relax. Shane grunted, pulling a pair of bolt cutters from a backpack. The lock on my gate was a heavy 100-year-old piece of iron. It looked formidable, but its mechanism was simple. With a loud snap that echoed in the quiet street, the lock broke. They were in. They didn't go for the front door. They knew better. They slipped along the side of the house, moving down the stone pathway that led to the first-floor piazza. This was exactly what I had predicted. The side doors with their old-fashioned locks seemed like the weakest point of entry. They paused beneath the sprawling branches of my magnolia tree, directly in the sights of my second camera. "All right, what are we doing?" Ricky asked, his voice laced with anxiety. "Daniel just said to send a message." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means we make it look like a robbery gone wrong." Shane said, his voice low and guttural. "Rough the place up. Break some stuff. Then we wait for him to come home tomorrow. We'll be waiting inside. When he walks in, we finish it." My blood ran cold. hearing it said so plainly. This wasn't just a scare tactic. This was the night they had planned to kill me. The feigned robbery was their cover. They would lie in wait for me to walk into my own home, into my own murder. The knowledge didn't spark fear. It forged the last of my resolve into something hard and sharp as steel. I watched as Ricky pulled a Slim Jim from his pocket and went to work on the lock of the French doors to the drawing room. He was clumsy. It took him nearly 3 minutes. His cursing picked up clearly by the piazza microphone. Finally, with a soft click, the door swung open. They slipped inside, disappearing from the view of my exterior cameras. But that was fine. The interior show was just beginning. My plan relied on a principle I learned long ago. Control the environment and you control the outcome. My house was now their prison, and they didn't even know it. Before leaving, I had made a few modifications. The main breaker in the basement was rigged with a simple remote switch. The moment they were both inside, I clicked a button on a small fob in my hotel room. Every light in the house, every appliance, every bit of power died. The house was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. On my laptop, I switched to the interior camera feed from the drawing room, which, along with the others, was running on a battery backup system. I could see their shadowy forms outlined by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. What the hell was that? Ricky yelped. Power go out. Shut up. Shane hissed. Find your flashlight. A pair of weak flashlight beams cut through the darkness, darting nervously around the room, illuminating antique furniture portraits of my ancestors and shelves of leather-bound books. They were disoriented perfect. Now, for Phase 2, I had placed a series of small wireless speakers throughout the ground floor, the same type I had used in Shane's truck. They were hidden in air vents behind furniture under tables. From my laptop, I activated the first one located in the hallway, just outside the drawing room. It started with a floorboard creaking. A single distinct sound I had recorded myself days earlier. The flashlight beams snapped toward the doorway. Did you hear that? Ricky whispered. It's an old house idiot. It makes noises. Shane's voice was tight. He was trying to sound tough, but the tracker on his truck had already frayed his nerves. I waited a full minute. Then, from a speaker in the far corner of the dining room, I played another sound, the soft metallic slide of a deadbolt being thrown. It was a sound of someone else being locked in with them. Okay, that ain't the house, Ricky said, his voice trembling. Someone's in here with us, man. There's no one here. Shane insisted, but his flashlight beam was now sweeping the room frantically. This was the core of the strategy, not to confront them, but to unravel them, to use the history and the silence of my own home as a weapon. They expected an empty house, a simple job. Instead, they were in a dark, unpredictable space that seemed to be alive, a space that was actively working against them. I let them stew in their fear for another 5 minutes, watching them jump at every shadow. Their whispered argument grew more heated. Ricky wanted to leave. Shane, committed to the $50,000 payday, refused. Then I delivered the masterstroke I had hacked into Daniel's phone, a simple task, given that he used the same password for everything his birthdate eyed, composed a text message, and scheduled it to send. At this exact time, the sender would appear as unknown number. As I watched them argue, a phone chirped. It was Shane's. He pulled it out, his flashlight beam illuminating his face, his eyes wide with confusion. I had the audio feed. I heard him read the text message aloud in a shaky voice. The old man knows he's not in Colombia. The cops are on their way. Get out now. You weren't paid enough for this. What the hell is this? Who sent this? Ricky practically screamed. I told you this was a bad idea. It's a setup. Daniel set us up. The accusation hung in the darkroom. Panic had taken root. The text, supposedly from a third party, shattered their trust in their employer. It reframed the situation entirely. They weren't hunters anymore. They were the prey caught in a trap laid by their own boss. Daniel wouldn't. Shane started, but his voice lacked conviction. The hell he wouldn't. Ricky shot back. He saves 40 grand and gets rid of us at the same time. We gotta go. Now this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Chaos. They scrambled back toward the French doors they'd entered through. But I had another surprise for them. While they were distracted, I had activated a magnetic lock it installed at the top of the door frame. The old lock Ricky had picked was irrelevant. The door was now sealed. Shane threw his considerable weight against it. It didn't budge. He slammed against it again. The old wood groaned, but held firm. The look on their faces, illuminated by their frantic flashlight beams, was pure distilled terror. They were trapped. Their exit was gone. Their employer had seemingly betrayed them, and they were in a dark house with someone or something that was toying with them. They began to smash at the windows, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the night. It was a beautiful sound. It was the sound of my alarm system, the silent alarm triggering a direct call to the Charleston Police Department. On the other side of town, I smiled, closed my laptop, and took a sip of my cold hotel coffee. The police response time in this neighborhood was on average 4 minutes. I had a feeling my 2 visitors weren't going anywhere. The aftermath was exactly as I'd orchestrated. The Charleston PD arrived to find 2 panicked men, one with a bleeding hand from a shattered window pane trapped inside my drawing room. They were surrounded by evidence of a break-in carrying burglary tools. Their story, that they were hired by the homeowners, Nephew, to send a message, sounded like a desperate, preposterous lie. To the police, it was a simple BE case closed. They were arrested and taken downtown. The beauty of the plan was that I was on paper, completely removed from it. I was the elderly victim away, on a trip whose home had been violated. I received the call from the police department around 3:00 a.m. I performed my role flawlessly, expressing shock, fear, and immense gratitude. I told them I would cut my trip short and be home by morning. I arrived back at my house to find a police cruiser still parked out front and a patrolman taking photos of the broken window. Mrs. Gable was on her porch, wringing her hands with worry. I played the part of the shaken but resilient old man, thanking the officers profusely and reassuring my neighbor that I was unharmed. Inside the house was a mess. They had knocked over a lamp and shattered a vase in their panic, but the real damage was minimal. I spent the morning with a glazier repairing the window and a locksmith installing new high-security locks on all the doors, a very reasonable precaution for a man who had just experienced a break-in. Daniel called me around noon. His voice was a tightrope walk of feigned shock and genuine panic. "Uncle Art." "Oh my God, I just heard. Are you okay?" "I can't believe this happened." I let him talk, letting the silence from my end of the line amplify his anxiety. "I'm fine, Daniel." A little shaken, of course. "They caught the 2 men." "They did? That's great news. Just some local trash, I assume." He was fishing, desperate to know what Shane and Ricky had told the police. "I suppose," I said calmly. "The police said they were telling some wild story about being hired by someone. Can you imagine?" The desperation of some people. I could almost hear the sigh of relief through the phone. He thought he was in the clear. He thought his 2 hired fools had been dismissed as liars, and he was safe. This was a critical error on his part. He underestimated not only me, but the desperation of his own pawns. Shane and Ricky were now facing serious prison time for armed burglary. Their loyalty to Daniel which was only ever $50,000 deep, was about to evaporate. All I had to do was give it a little push. That afternoon, I made a phone call to a man I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Ben Carter was a retired Charleston PD detective who now worked as a private investigator. In my former life, our paths had crossed on a joint task force. He was smart, tenacious, and owed me a significant favor. I met him for coffee at a small cafe on Daniel Island, a neutral suburban territory, far from the prying eyes of my neighborhood. I laid it all out for him. The meeting with Croft, the financial research on Daniel, the emails. The text message I'd sent, I handed him a thumb drive containing all the surveillance footage from the night of the break-in, including the crystal-clear audio of Shane and Ricky discussing their plan to murder me. Ben listened without interruption, his expression grim. When I was finished, he took a long sip of his coffee. "Art, you should have come to me sooner. What you did was insane and brilliant, but mostly insane." "A calculated risk," I corrected. "I couldn't go to the police with just a suspicion. I needed leverage. Now I have it." "Those two are in holding, scared out of their minds. Daniel thinks he's safe. I want you to be the one to apply the pressure." "What do you have in mind?" "Shane and Ricky need a lawyer," I said. "A very good public defender, perhaps. One who gets a visit from a concerned private citizen who happens to have video evidence that his new clients were not just burglars, but pawns in a conspiracy to commit murder. Evidence that could be their only ticket to a plea bargain." Ben grinned. "You want me to leak the video to their defense attorney? I want you to arm their attorney." I clarified. "Give him the weapon he needs to save his clients by turning them against their employer. I want Daniel's name on an official police report, introduced not by a senile old man, but by the sworn testimony of his own hired help, backed by digital evidence. I also want you to pay a visit to Mr. Croft. Show him a snippet of the video, just enough to let him know his client's little scheme has unraveled. A man like Croft values his law license above all else. He'll cut Daniel loose so fast, it'll create a sonic boom." The plan was in motion. Ben, a master of back-channel communication, got the thumb drive into the hands of the right public defender. As predicted, faced with irrefutable proof of a murder conspiracy, Shane and Ricky sang like canaries, giving detailed formal statements implicating Daniel Fletcher as the man who hired them. The charges were immediately elevated from burglary to conspiracy to commit murder. 2 days later, 2 homicide detectives from the Charleston Police Department drove to Charlotte and arrested my nephew at his third-rate brokerage firm in front of all of his colleagues. The initial charge was conspiracy, but the financial crimes I had uncovered were about to be added to the list. Ben had quietly passed my research on Daniel's debts and shady business deals to the lead detective, suggesting there was a strong financial motive worth investigating. They froze his assets and started digging. The war was not yet won, but the decisive battle was over. Daniel was in jail. His hired thugs were cooperating witnesses. His lawyer Croft had formally withdrawn as counsel, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. The narrative Daniel had tried to build, of the dotty old uncle, had crumbled, replaced by the truth, a greedy nephew who had tried to murder his last living relative for an inheritance. I sat on my piazza, the evening air, warm and filled with the scent of jasmine. I had my house back. I had my life back. But a strange sense of emptiness settled over me. This wasn't a clean victory. It was a messy, painful extermination of my own family. I had methodically, coldly, and successfully destroyed my sister's only son. I had used the skills I'd spent a lifetime honing for my country against my own blood. There was no joy in it. There was only the grim satisfaction of a necessary job completed. But I knew Daniel. I knew his arrogance. Even from a jail cell, he would not believe he was truly beaten. He would try something. He had one last card to play, and I had a chilling suspicion of what it would be. The legal battle was just beginning, and he would try to make it personal. He would try to destroy my name, just as I had destroyed his freedom. The weeks that followed. Daniel's arrest were a blur of legal proceedings and unwelcome local fame. My quiet, anonymous life was over. The story was too juicy for the Charleston news outlets to ignore. Local philanthropist 73 thwarts Nephew's murder-for-hire plot. I was painted as a plucky, unassuming senior citizen who had cleverly outsmarted his greedy relative. They had no idea. The truth of my past remained my own, a secret advantage I had no intention of revealing. I gave one short, polite statement to the press, on my lawyer's advice, then refused all further interviews, retreating back into the sanctuary of my home. Daniel, unable to make bail due to the severity of the charges and his frozen assets, hired a new lawyer, bulldog public defender, who specialized in lost causes. His strategy became clear, almost immediately: character assassination. If he couldn't dispute the evidence, he would discredit the man who gathered it. The first salvo came in a pretrial hearing. Daniel's lawyer filed a motion to have all my surveillance evidence suppressed, arguing that I, not Daniel, was the one who had broken the law. He claimed I had conducted illegal wiretapping and digital surveillance, painting me as a paranoid, manipulative old man who had entrapped his loving, concerned nephew. It was a bold, disgusting strategy. They dragged my name through the mud. They brought up my quiet, solitary life as evidence of my instability. They interviewed distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, coaxing quotes about how I was always a bit eccentric after Eleanor passed. They were trying to build the very narrative Daniel had failed to establish. Before that, I was senile, paranoid, and unreliable. The media, scenting a new, more complex angle to the story, started to bite. The headlines shifted from hero granddad to questions mount in Charleston inheritance plot. I was forced to sit in sterile courtroom chambers and listen to a lawyer half my age describe me as a vindictive, lonely old man who had fabricated a conspiracy because his nephew had suggested he consider end-of-life options. It was infuriating. My own lawyer, a competent but conventional man named Peterson, assured me that the evidence was too strong and their attempts would fail. But I saw the danger. A courtroom is a theater. It's not about absolute truth. It's about the most convincing story. Daniel was trying to sell a story where he was the victim. I knew I couldn't just sit back and trust the system. I had to deliver the final, undeniable blow. I had to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Daniel's malice was not a recent development. I needed to show a pattern of behavior. I went back to the digital ghost I had planted in his life. I spent my nights sifting through years of his archived emails, his cloud storage, his financial records. I was looking for something more, something that went beyond the murder plot. And in the deep archives of a deleted email account, I found it. It was a string of emails from 6 years prior, just after my sister's death. They were between Daniel and my sister's insurance company. My sister and her husband had a modest life insurance policy, one I had helped them set up years ago. The sole beneficiary was Daniel, but there was a complication. The police report from the car accident had been ambiguous about who had died first, my sister or her husband. The insurance policy had a survivorship clause if the beneficiary, Daniel's father, died at the same time, or within 24 hours of the insured, my sister. The payout would go to a secondary beneficiary. I was that secondary beneficiary I had forgotten all about it. The insurance company, following procedure, had initiated an investigation to determine the order of death before paying out Daniel. It turned out, hadn't wanted to wait. The emails showed him bullying, threatening, and harassing the insurance agent. But then it got worse. I found the attached document. It was a forged letter, supposedly from one of the paramedics at the scene of the accident, stating that my sister had survived for at least an hour after her husband had passed. It was a clumsy forgery, but in the chaos of the situation, the understaffed insurance company had accepted it. They had paid the claim to Daniel. He had stolen from me and from his own mother's final wishes years before he ever considered having me killed. He hadn't just become a monster. He had been one all along. This was it. This was the character evidence that would shatter his defense. It proved his greed, his dishonesty, and his willingness to commit fraud. It established a clear pattern. I gave the evidence to my lawyer. Peterson was stunned. This is a game changer. Arthur forgery insurance fraud. This goes to the very heart of his character. It proves the motive for everything else. The day the evidence was introduced in court was the day Daniel's defense finally crumbled. His lawyer objected fiercely, but the judge allowed it, ruling that it was directly relevant to establishing motive and character. The prosecutor presented the forged letter. He presented the emails. He then called the retired paramedic to the stand, who testified under oath that he had never written or seen the letter before in his life. I watched Daniel's face as the testimony unfolded. His smug arrogance, the mask he had worn for so long, finally cracked. He looked pale, small, and utterly defeated. The jury saw it. Everyone in the courtroom saw it. He wasn't the victim. He was a predator who had been preying on his family for years. The trial was swift after that. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict him on all counts. 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of a felony, and now multiple counts of wire and insurance fraud. Shane and Ricky, in exchange for their testimony, received significantly reduced sentences for aggravated burglary. The sentencing was a month later. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, a place I hadn't intended to be. I felt I owed it to Eleanor and to my sister to see it through to the end. Daniel was brought in, wearing a drab prison jumpsuit, the expensive suits and confident smirk, replaced by cheap cotton and a look of hollow despair. He refused to look at me. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in a state penitentiary. As the guards led him away, his eyes finally met mine across the courtroom. There was no remorse in them, only a flat, bottomless hatred, the look of a man who had lost everything and blamed the one person he couldn't manage to kill. The reporters were waiting outside the Charleston County Courthouse, a frenzy of cameras and microphones. I ignored them all, walking slowly to my car. The war was over. The victory was absolute, but it felt as hollow as my nephew's eyes. Life returned to a semblance of normal, or what passes for normal, after your nephew tries to have you murdered. The media eventually moved on to the next scandal. My neighbors, once full of pity and morbid curiosity, went back to treating me as they always had. The quiet widower with the beautiful garden. Mrs. Gable brought me a homemade pecan pie and didn't mention the trial, once a kindness for which I was eternally grateful. The seasons in Charleston turned. The oppressive humidity of summer gave way to the mild golden autumn. The camellias in my garden began to bloom, their vibrant pinks and whites, a defiant splash of life against the old brick walls. I took steps to secure my future. I had a new will, drawn up by Peterson. My house. The house Daniel had tried to kill me for would be donated to the Charleston Preservation Society upon my death, ensuring it would be cared for in perpetuity. My liquid assets and portfolio would be liquidated and used to create a charitable trust in Eleanor's name funding arts education for underprivileged children in the Low Country. Daniel would not get a single cent. He would not even get a mention. In the eyes of my last will and testament, he had ceased to exist. Ben Carter. The P. I would occasionally stop by for coffee on my piazza. We never spoke of the case directly, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. He was one of the few people on earth who knew the full truth, who knew I was not some lucky old man, but the architect of my own salvation. He'd look out at my garden, at the peaceful sun-dappled sanctuary I had built, and shake his head with a small wry smile. "You're a piece of work." Art, he'd say. I would just nod and take a sip of my coffee. Sometimes late at night, when the house was silent, and the only sound was the sighing of the wind in the live oaks, I would think about Daniel. I didn't feel anger anymore, or even sadness. I felt a profound and chilling emptiness. I thought of my sister, of the bright, hopeful boy she had raised, and I wondered where it had all gone so wrong. Was the darkness always in him, or did the world put it there? I would never know. He was a ghost to me now, a problem that had been analyzed, neutralized, and filed away. One afternoon I received a letter. It was from the state penitentiary. The handwriting on the envelope was Daniel's. I held it for a long time, feeling the weight of the paper in my hand. It was the first and only communication I had received from him since the sentencing. I didn't know what it could possibly contain. An apology, a threat, a plea for forgiveness. I walked out to the brick incinerator in my back garden, the one I used to burn fallen leaves and old documents. I stood before it, the unopened letter in my hand. For a moment I was tempted to read it, to look for some sign of humanity, some flicker of the boy I once knew. But then I remembered the look in his eyes in the courtroom, the hollow, hateful stare of a cornered animal. I knew then that whatever was in that letter, it was not for me. It was for him. It was a final, desperate attempt to exercise some power over me, to get inside my head one last time. Reading it would mean he had succeeded. It would mean the war wasn't truly over. I dropped the unopened envelope into the incinerator. I lit a match and watched as the flames curled around the edges of the paper, turning the words I would never read into gray, weightless ash that drifted up into the clear Carolina sky. He had wanted my house, my money, my life, and in the end, all he inherited was my silence. The end.